The Norka. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen. They had 3 sons, 2 of them with their wits about them, and the third was a bit of a simpleton. Now the king had a deer park in which there were quantities of wild animals of different kinds, and to that park there used to come a huge beast. Norka was its name, and do fearful mischief, devouring some of the animals every night. The king did all he could, but he was unable to destroy it. So he at last called his sons together and said, "Whoever will destroy the Norka, to him I will give half my kingdom." The eldest son undertook the task. As soon as it was night, he took his weapons and set out. But before he reached the park, he went into a traktor, or a tavern, and there he spent the whole night in revelry. When he came to his senses, it was too late, and the dawn had already broken. He felt himself a disgrace in the eyes of his father, and there was no help for it. The next day the second son went, and did just the same. Their father scolded them both soundly, and there was an end of it. Well, almost. On the third day the youngest son undertook the task. They all laughed at him to scorn, because he was, well, stupid, and feeling sure he wouldn't do anything. But he took his arms and went straight into the park, and sat down on the grass in such a position that the moment he went to sleep his weapons would prick him and keep him awake. Presently the midnight hour sounded. The earth began to shake, and the Norka came rushing up, and burst right through the fence into the park, so huge it was. The prince pulled himself together, leapt to his feet, and crossed himself, then went straight at the beast. It fled back, and the prince ran after it, but soon he saw that he couldn't catch it on foot, so he hastened to the stable, laid his hands on the best horse there, and went off in pursuit. Presently he came up with the beast, and they began to fight. They fought and fought, and the prince gave the beast 3 great wounds. At last they were both utterly exhausted, so they both lay down to take a short rest. But the moment the prince closed his eyes, up jumped the beast and took to flight. The prince's horse woke him up, and he jumped up in a moment and set off in pursuit, caught up to the beast again, and they began fighting. Again the prince gave the beast 3 wounds, but then he and the beast lay down to rest. Thereupon away fled the beast as before. The prince caught up, and again gave it 3 wounds, but all of a sudden, just as the prince began chasing it for the 4th time, the beast fled into a great white stone, tilted it up, and escaped into the other world, crying out to the prince, "Then only will you overcome me when you enter here." The prince went home, and told his father all that had happened, and asked him for a leather rope plaited, long enough to reach the other world. The father ordered this to be done, and when the rope was made, the prince called to his brothers, and he and they, having taken servants with him, and everything that was needed for a whole year, set out for the place where the beast had disappeared under the stone. When they got there, they built a palace on the spot, and lived in it for some time. But when everything was ready, the youngest brother said to the others, "Now, brothers, who is going to lift the stone?" Neither of them could so much as stir it, but as soon as he touched it, away it flew in the distance, though it was ever so big, big as a hill. And when he had flung the stone aside, he spoke a second time to his brothers. "Who is going into the other world to overcome the Norka?" Neither of them offered to do so. Then he laughed at them for being such cowards. "Well, brothers, farewell. Lower me into the other world, and don't go away from here, but as soon as the cord is jerked, pull it up." His brothers lowered him accordingly, but when he had reached the other world beneath the earth, he went on his way. He walked and walked. Presently he espied a horse with rich trappings, and said to him, "Hail, Prince Ivan! Long have I waited for thee." He mounted the horse and rode on, and rode, until he saw standing before him a palace made of copper. He entered the courtyard, tied up his horse, and went indoors. In one of the rooms the dinner was laid out. He sat down and dined, and then he went to a bedroom. There he found a bed, on which he lay down to rest. Presently there came in a lady, more beautiful than can be imagined anywhere but in a fairy tale, who said, "Thou art in my house, name thyself. If thou art an old man, thou shalt be my father. If a middle-aged man, my brother. But if a young man, thou shalt be my husband dear. If thou art a woman, and an old one, thou shalt be my grandmother. If middle-aged, my mother. If a girl, thou shalt be my own sister." Thereupon he came forth, and when she saw him, she was delighted with him, and said, "Wherefore, Prince Ivan, my dear husband thou shalt be. Where hast thou come hither?" Then he told her all that had happened, and said, "The beast which thou wishest to overcome is my brother. He is staying just now with my second sister, who lives not far from here in another palace. I bound up the wounds 3 that you did give him." Well, after this they drank and enjoyed themselves, and held sweet converse together. And then the prince took leave of her, and on to the second sister, the one who lived in a silver palace, and with her also he stayed a while. She told him that her brother Norka was then at the youngest sister's. So he went on to the youngest sister, who lived in a golden palace. She told him that her brother was at this time asleep on the blue sea, and she gave him a sword of steel and a draught of water of strength, and told him to cut off her brother's head with a single stroke. And when he had heard these things, he went on his way. And when the prince came to the blue sea, he looked. There slept the Norka on a stone in the middle of the sea, and when it snored, the water was agitated for 7 miles around. The prince crossed himself and went up to it, and smote it on the head with a sword. The head jumped off, saying a while, "Well, I'm done for now," and it rolled away into the sea. After killing the beast, the prince went back again, picking up all the 3 sisters along the way, with the intention of taking them up into the outer world. For they loved him and would not be separated from him. Each of them turned her palace into an egg, for they were enchantresses. And they taught him how to turn the eggs into palaces and back again, and they handed over the eggs to him. And then they all went to the place from which they dwelt and had been hoisted up to the upper world. And when they came to where the rope was, the prince took a hold of it and made the hastens fast to it. And then he jerked away at the rope, and his brothers began to haul it up. And when they hauled it up and had set eyes on the wondrous maidens, they went aside and said, "Let's lower the rope and pull our brother up part of the way, and then cut the rope. Perhaps he'll be killed, and then, if he isn't, he'll never give up these beauties." So when they had agreed to this, they lowered the rope, but their brother was no fool. He guessed what they were at, and so he fastened the rope to a stone, and then gave it a pull. His brothers hoisted the stone to a great height, and then cut the rope. Down fell the stone and broke into pieces. The prince poured forth tears and went away, while he walked and walked. Presently a storm rose, and lightning flashed, and thunder roared, and rain fell in torrents. He went up to a tree in order to make shelter under it. And on that tree he saw some young birds, which were being thoroughly drenched. So he took off his coat and covered them with it, and he himself sat down under the tree. Presently there came flying a bird, such a big one that the light was blotted out of the sky. It had been dark before, but now it became darker still. Now this was the mother of those small birds which the prince had covered up. And when the bird had come flying up and perceived that her little ones were covered over, she said,
"I was wrapped by nestlings."
And presently, seeing the prince, she added,
"Didst thou do that? Thanks! In return, ask me for anything thou desire. I will do anything for thee."
"And carry me to the other world?" he asked.
"Make me a large vessel with a partition in the middle," said she. "Catch all sorts of game and put them into one half of it, and into the other pour half the water, so that there may be meat and drink for me."
And the prince did this. Then the bird, having taken the vessel on her back, with the prince sitting in the middle of it, began to fly off. After flying some distance, she brought him to his journey's end, and took leave of him, and flew away back. But when he went to the house of a certain tailor, and he engaged himself as his servant. So much the worse for wear he was, so thoroughly had he altered in appearance that nobody would have suspected him of being a prince. Having entered to the service of his master, the prince began to ask what was going on in the country. And his master replied, "Our two princes, for the third one has disappeared, have brought away brides from the other world, and want to marry them, but those brides refuse. For they insist on having their wedding clothes made from their first, exactly like those they had in the other world, and that entering and without measuring them. The king has called all the workmen together, but none of them will undertake to do it." The prince, having heard all this, said, "Go to the king, master, and tell him that you will provide everything that's in your line." "However, I cannot undertake clothes of that sort. I work for quite common folk," said his master. "Go along, master. I will answer for everything," said the prince. So the tailor went, and the king was delighted that at least one good, hard-working man had been found, and gave him as much money as he ever wanted. When his tailor had settled everything, he went home, and the prince said to him, "Now then, pray to God and lie down to sleep. Tomorrow all will be ready." And the tailor followed his lad's advice and went to bed. Midnight sounded. The prince arose and went out to the city into the fields. He took out of his pocket the eggs the maidens had given him, and as they had taught him, he turned them into 3 palaces. Into each of these he entered, and took the maidens' robes, and went out again, and turned the palaces back into eggs, and he went home. And when he got there, he hung up the robes on the wall, and then lay down to sleep. Early in the morning his master awoke, and behold, there hung such robes as he had never seen before, all shining with gold and silver and precious stones. He was delighted, and he seized them and carried them off to the king. When the princesses saw that the clothes were those which had been theirs in the other world, they guessed that Prince Ivan was in this world, so they exchanged glances with each other, and held their peace. And the master, handing over the clothes, went home, but he no longer found his dear journeyman there, for the prince had gone to a shoemaker's, and him too he sent to work for the king. And in the same way he went round all the other artificers, and they all proffered him thanks, in so much as he had helped enrich them. By the time the princely workmen had gone around to all the artificers, the princesses had received what they had asked for, All their clothes were just like what they had in the other world. They wept bitterly because the prince had not come, and it was impossible for them to hold out any longer. It was necessary that they should be married. But when they were ready for the wedding, the youngest bride said to the king,
"Allow me, my father, to go and give alms to the beggars."
He gave her leave, and she went and began bestowing alms upon them, and examining them closely. And when she had come to one of them, and was going to give him some money, she caught sight of the ring which she had given the prince in the other world, and her sister's rings too, for it really was he. So she seized him by the hand and brought him into the hall, and said to the king,
"Here is he who brought us out from the other world. His brothers forbade us to say that he was alive, threatening to slay us if we did."
Then the king was wroth with those sons, and punished them as he thought best. And afterwards 3 weddings were celebrated.